Good morning. My name is Laura Christian Imbernoni. On behalf of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland, welcome on this beautiful snowy day to the eighth and last forum of the Winter-Spring series. Today's topic, fracking, radioactive brine, and icy roads. The UUC Forum Committee has offered forums about important topics like today's for more than 25 years. We organize them as a congregational service to the community to support personal reflection and social action, and to encourage individual and collective growth for all of us here. We're so glad to have you with us virtually. It's my pleasure now to welcome Nancy King-Smith as a special coordinator for today's topic. Nancy is a hardworking and well-loved member of our congregation, and she has a lifelong commitment to the preservation of nature, having served for many years as executive director of the Nature Center at Shaker Lakes. She is active with UU Ministry for Earth and Green Sanctuary at the national, state, and local levels, including here at UUCC. Now Nancy will introduce the topic and today's speakers. Nancy.
Thank you and welcome to all. Most of us are aware that fracking for natural gas has many consequences for the environment: methane, water pollution, even earthquakes among them. What we may be less aware of is the effort to commodify the wastewater known as brine as a de-icer on Ohio's roads, a product called aqua salina. Limited testing indicates the brine contains radioactive concentrations that can pollute soil or become airborne as radioactive dust, thus contaminating drinking water and agricultural products. This toxic radioactive waste is also disposed of in Class 2 injection wells, where it can also contaminate groundwater. To help us understand what is going on, including legislation currently proposed, we have two members of the Ohio Brine Task Force, which is a group of thoughtful and committed Ohioans interested in stopping the hazardous practice of brine spreading in our communities. Cheryl Johncox is a lifelong resident of Ohio. She received her bachelor's degree in natural resources management and policy from the Ohio State University. She spent more than 10 years working to protect Ohioans and our land, air, and water from polluters. In her current role as part of Sierra Club's National Beyond Dirty Fuels team, Cheryl works to move Ohio beyond fossil fuels. Originally from the Cuyahoga County area, Cheryl and her family live in rural Union County. Cheryl was a candidate for Ohio's 86th House District in 2012. In 2005, she was the recipient of the National Conservation Achievement Award from the National Wildlife Federation for her work on international sustainable development. Ted Auch received his BS in plant and soil science from the University of Vermont in 2000. After getting an MF in strip mine reclamation ecology, he pursued his Ph.D. modeling the soil and plant responses to various climate change scenarios. He moved to Cleveland in 2012 to conduct a second postdoc, looking at various vacant land repurposing scenarios across the Great Lakes post-industrial population. Since then, Ted has been working at the FracTracker Alliance, researching the myriad impacts of fracking with a focus on the industry's water, waste, and land use impacts. His current work is focusing on the impact that brine production, disposal, and spillage is having on highly productive agricultural lands in North Dakota and revisiting the Dakota Access Pipeline. He serves on the Faith Communities for a Sustainable Future, that's the FACT board, as well as Shaker Heights Tree Advisory Board. However, Ted is most proud of his two boys, Michael and Satchel, and his amazing wife, Julia, all of whom have called Shaker Heights home for the past 5+ years He's an avid birder, runner, and hack guitarist. Before the speakers begin their presentation, I'll mention the question and answer part of the forum just after the presentations. You are invited to find the Q&A icon on your screen, click on it, and type any questions you may have during the presentations. Afterwards, you'll be recognized by first name if your question is chosen, unless you choose the anonymous option. So Cheryl and Ted, we welcome your comments. And Ted, I think you're up first, so welcome.
Oh yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you for having us here on a extremely snowy morning while my kids are outside finally getting some energy out. I appreciate the time and the opportunity to talk to you today. Can everyone see my screen? Right. So I'm gonna yield the floor to Cheryl on the specifics about legislation, but I think it's important to nest what we're talking about with respect to brine spreading and its impacts on Ohio within a larger conversation, which is, to me, the issues around oil and gas inefficiencies. So fracking, for all of the benefits that were hyped in Columbus and nationwide under the veil of energy independence, did a really good job at the outset in hiding or otherwise just not talking about their waste footprint and all the waste they plan to produce here and import into Ohio and produce all over the country. And I like to look at the fracking industry along two trend lines. This is kind of a theoretical way in which I look at fracking, but I think it's really helpful in framing why they want to spread brine in Ohio, and why they're coming up with bills in Ohio to commodify brine. And the primary reason why I think that is that you can see here the blue line on the left-hand side is oil and gas production. And really what we see in Ohio is you see that the production has gone down precipitously over time. But what hasn't gone down and has actually gone in the other direction, that is from the bottom left to the top right, is the demand for water, the demand for sand and chemicals, and the production of waste. And that has put a tremendous pressure on our injection wells, on our roads, and on our regulators in Columbus. So this is kind of these inefficiencies within the fracking landscape were never good to begin with, and they've gotten much, much worse in the last 8+ years that I've been looking at it. I'd like to include a couple of images to show folks that fracking isn't just a drill rig in Ohio. It consists of all manner of things, whether it's water impoundments, injection wells, access roads, gas plants, you name it. So fracking, the oil and gas industry really never talked about their waste footprint, and they never ever mentioned the myriad infrastructure that they would need to build in Ohio to keep themselves propped up. It's also important to talk about what the industry is talking about now is spreading brine and commodifying brine from legacy wells, from older oil and gas wells. But to me, we have to look at this from a long game perspective, and we have to think to ourselves, why is it that they are constricting or constraining what they talk about to just legacy wells? What is the long-term goal of the industry? And to me, they must be focusing on their unconventional waste production, because as you can see here, the red dots are all the legacy wells in Ohio and the brine that they produced over time. And those orange dots in the bottom right corner of the state, those are unconventional wells. And the data that we've collected over time proves that legacy wells compared to unconventional wells produce a fraction of the brine. So when we're hearing them talk about legacy wells, and this is all we really want to focus on, I think that's nonsense. I think they have a long game in mind. And I think it's very, very dangerous, the kind of framework that we're allowing them to set up here in Columbus, because we know that the unconventional wells, from the small sample size we have, can be quite radioactive. And the fact that we're going to actually make a platform and commodify this stuff is very, very scary. Because what we should be doing in Ohio is we should be putting pressure on this industry to produce less waste, become more efficient. We're doing the exact opposite with this type of legislation, and it's very, very scary. It's important also to mention that Ohio is the dumping ground for Pennsylvania and West Virginia in the form of our Class 2 injection wells. And here's some data that I've collected over time that shows here on the left-hand side, you can see average Class 2 injection well disposal rates and total disposal rates, as well as that red bar is 2020, because unfortunately the state of Ohio went from reporting fracking waste quarterly to annually, which is, again, putting us behind the 8 ball in terms of understanding the oil and gas industry. This right-hand figure is I think an interesting graph, because what it shows you here is the amount of water that the industry uses, whether it's legacy wells or unconventional wells, is directly correlated with the amount of waste that they produce. So whatever goes down, a fraction of it is going to come back up, but it's not going to come back as good water. It's going to come back as radioactive brine. So that relationship, you can't talk about brine without talking about the impacts that this industry's had on our water, on the hydrology of Southeast Ohio. I'll briefly go through this slide. This is basically just a slide that shows you what we're talking about here. We're not talking about injection wells. These injection wells were never designed for the levels of for the pressures and volumes that they're experiencing by way of fracking waste. You can see here, there's a Trumbull County Cleese well, which is now, I don't think that's operating right now. And then the Dietrich well in Ashtabula County. And you can see they can just dump the brine in those pits and let that evaporate. So the level of oversight that we have over our waste stream from unconventional and conventional waste is really kind of shameful when you consider what other states are doing. And I've looked at that quite a bit. Oklahoma, Texas, that have a long history of this, are doing way more in terms of oversight of this. And even there, they are having huge issues with regard to earthquake activity and the like. I'd like to show a couple pictures here to show what an injection well actually looks like. And these are 2 additional ones. I'd like to show these because these are the 2 most active wells in the state of Ohio that have taken in the most waste. And quite a bit of this waste is coming in from Pennsylvania. If you ever go down to Cambridge, Ohio, the image on the top is to the northeast corner of the 77 and 70 intersection. And the image on the bottom right is to the southwest of that intersection in downtown Cambridge, Ohio. These sites have taken a huge amount of brine waste. And the industry knows they have a huge issue on their hands and they can't seem to figure it out. So they're developing legislation to deal with this kind of waste stream. I also wanted to just show a couple of photos here. This one on the top left is a photo I took with my drone showing truck traffic in rural Belmont County. And if, someone who I know that lives right at that corner told me that there's 300 trucks that come through that corner, brine trucks, during the peak of fracking. So, I mean, you're talking about a tremendous pressure being put on our roads, our watersheds, and our people. The bottom right image is taken from rural West Virginia, and that's just kind of what you end up seeing in West Virginia and Ohio when you have all these brine trucks. It's a huge, as I said, huge pressure on the system that the system was not designed to deal with and was never discussed by the oil and gas sector. And then here is a map that I put together, which shows waste production in Pennsylvania and where it's going in Ohio. So why is Pennsylvania disposing of all their waste in Ohio? A couple reasons. One, Pennsylvania does not have primacy over their class 2 injection well system. So they don't have as easy a way of permitting class 2 wells. Ohio has decided that they want to go all in on waste disposal. Now, why that is, there's a bunch of different reasons for that, which we can get into. But the point is that Pennsylvania is leaning entirely, very much so, on Ohio to dispose of its waste. And I would imagine that these commodification brine spreading bills are going to make that even easier for them to do. A couple of the things that we do at FracTracker are we map stuff. And here's a map of the oil and gas industry's fracking waste landscape in Ohio. The red dots are the brine haulers. The brown dots are the class 2 injection wells, and there's all manner of stuff in this data. I'm happy to share this data with anyone that's interested. We think that it's a valuable contribution, and these are interactive maps that anyone can use. And then more recently, we've done some work mapping brine spreading in Ohio, and you can see the red squares are where more brine is being spread. So fortunately in Cuyahoga County, we're doing okay. But what worries me is this unconventional industry and what that would mean for brine spreading writ large in the state. So these are the kinds of maps and data sets that we produce. We think that informing kind of policy decisions and advocacy activism with data is a valuable thing, and that's what we've been doing for a bunch of years. This is just an example of the kinds of landing pages that we have at our website. So I'm happy to share any of that data with you all and talk further, but I'll yield the floor to Cheryl. But I just want to say in closing that the general thesis that I'm taking from all this commodification and brine spreading stuff is that there's a long game being played by the oil and gas sector. And what they really want to do is make it easier to dispose of waste in dubious to extremely dangerous ways throughout Ohio. And I think we need to think about that from a long game perspective. And that's one of the major points of my presentation. So with that, I'll hand it over to Cheryl.
Thanks so much, Ted.
Sure.
And I want to thank also Nancy for inviting us to do this presentation this morning. It's wonderful to see you all, and I will go ahead and share my screen. So since 1985, Ohio has been allowing radioactive oil and gas waste to be spread on roads. And the Ohio Brine Task Force, with the help of FracTracker and their excellent data, has been working to educate our legislature about this practice. What we do know is that the Ohio Department of Health has not tested the effects of this on long term, which is very disturbing. We're very lucky on our team of the Brine Task Force to have a water hydrologist and geologist who worked at the Ohio State University, who's been doing work on this issue since 1985 when this began. So what we know is that radioactive isotopes of radium-226 and 228 have a half-life of about 13,000 years. So this material is compounding on our roadsides. And through our efforts of educating the legislature and educating agencies, believe it or not, about the effects of this material, we have made some advances. We have been able to get the Department of Health to say publicly that they have not tested it long term. We have been able to work with the Department of Transportation, and they are no longer, as of this year, will be buying this to spread on our state roadways. We have talked to the Turnpike Commission, and they are no longer using it because they say that there is a potential risk. And so our education with the legislature and with other agencies has been very, very important. What we do know is that it's still bought by municipalities, townships, and counties to be spread on their roadways, which is very, very troubling. Why does this matter? Well, for the third legislative session, one company has been pushing to have this material commodified. And what does it mean to have something commodified? It means that it can be bought and sold on store shelves, just like sugar or coffee. They have been pushing for this legislation for 3 legislative sessions, which is 6 years. And the Ohio Brine Task Force, despite a Republican stronghold on our legislature, have been able to get this bill stopped through research, through communication, through working with local communities that have this material spread in their area. So one of the couple of the things that we've been able to do to support communities that know this brine is being spread is to help them with public meetings, to provide them with information and some of Ted's information in his excellent maps, for them to have conversations with their local township trustees or their county commissioners to say, ask very specifically, are you purchasing radioactive oil and gas liquid waste for de-icing or dust suppressant on our roadways? You can't just roll up in there and say brine. Are you spreading brine? Because brine is like, everybody uses brine, right? We use brine on our turkeys at Thanksgiving. Very specifically, this is a specific type of material that the industry likes to call brine. But it's really radioactive, nasty water that has lots of chemicals that flows up from deep in the earth during the fracking process. So as you can read, there are some things here that we genuinely have to be nervous about. If these 2 pieces of legislation pass, You could see it on your store shelves. They market it as ancient seawater, and there is no warning label. When these bills would allow up to 333 times the allowable radioactive level to be sitting on your store shelves, and for consumers and community members to spread on their sidewalks, their driveways. You wouldn't know if Kroger's had spread this in their parking lot when you go there grocery shopping. So we're looking at extreme wrapping up of this material. That's HB 282 and Senate Bill 171. Right now, those bills are sitting in committee. We anticipate that through further communication and with help from community members like yourself, to continue to call, to continue to tell our state representatives that they need to vote no on these two bills. We hope that we will be successful for this General Assembly in stopping this. There is a very likely chance that this could move forward in the fall. As we know, there's going to be a lot of very important elections this fall. And depending on the outcomes of these elections, the legislature could again feel emboldened to give another blank check to this industry to be able to, unfortunately, harm our communities, our waterways, and our wildlife. So another scenario, imagine, if you will, you're out in your community, the sidewalks are icy. A lot of our larger communities have these little that have been modified ATV vehicles that drive around, and they spread salt or they spread brine on their sidewalks in order to prevent slippage. These bills become law. It will be very easy for your city, your township, your municipality to purchase this material without knowing what is in it. Spread it on your sidewalks. And you could be out with your children, you could be out walking your dog. They could get this contaminant on their feet. They could bring it into your house, and you would have no way of knowing. Right now, the Department of Natural Resources tracks where all of the sale of this radioactive material happens. This bill would strip that monitoring and would strip that data away from us. So Ted gets this information about where it's being spread right now from public information, directly from DNR. This bill would strip that authority for the Department of Natural Resources to be able to monitor where this toxic radioactive material is being spread. What can you do? What can you do as individuals? Well, first thing you can do is see this number that's at the top, 202-730-9006. If you pick up your phone, write down that number. That will connect you directly to your house member, your Ohio house member. And you can ask them. Tell them you live in Ohio. This is where I live. I am a member of your community. I'm very concerned about this bill. I'm concerned about the effect it could have on my family. It could have on my neighbors. It could have on the farmland and our farm animals, on our water, our drinking water. That's something that is very, very easy for you to do. The other thing that you could do is you could go to your county engineer's office and ask them directly and say, are you using oil and gas liquid waste for de-icing on our roads? Even if TED map shows you that you are not spreading it in your community, you can start a conversation with your local county engineer by asking them this question. Are you using it? If they say no, you can say, are you aware that there is legislation that would allow this to be bought and sold on the shelves of stores, and that we could have widespread use without community members knowing it, and make it easier for municipalities and local communities to purchase it without knowing. So that's an entry point for you to have this conversation. Next thing you can do is, once you've started that conversation with your local engineer, your local county or local elected official, you can let them know there are resources for them, that they can support these bills not being passed. We have 3 different sets of county resolutions or county ordinances that your local community can pass that would say, no, we're not going to do this in our communities. We don't want these bills to pass. And then you can send that, once it gets passed by your local elected office, you can send it to the Ohio Brine Task Force. You can send it to your state representative, House member. You can send it to your state senator and say, we want you to vote no on this bill, and our city supports us. It's one of the most powerful things that you can do is get your local elected officials involved. I'm gonna skip over some of these pictures, which are Ted's pictures. And just say the other way they dispose of this material is through class 2 injection wells. And Ted gave you some great figures on those injection wells and the millions of barrels that we're taking from all over this region in Ohio. The other thing I'd like to tell you today is that unfortunately, the Department of Natural Resources just rewrote the regulations for class 2 injection wells and the facilities that process the solid radioactive waste from fracking. They just rewrote these rules and they stripped many protections for community members in the entire state of Ohio. So they don't have to write a radiation protection plan for these facilities any longer. They gave the Department of Natural Resources chief of the Division of Oil and Gas the ability to waive any and all siting criteria for new injection wells and waste facilities. So it says in there, they're not supposed to put them within 100 feet of a private drinking well, surface water, or wetland. The chief, with a stroke of his pen, could waive that requirement and let them put it right next to your well, your stream, or your wetland. They failed to provide adequate setbacks for us and the environment. They failed to create rules that are enforceable and allow them to hold companies accountable when they have a spill or there's waste connected with these facilities. We have 36 facilities already permitted, or excuse me, 36 facilities that process fracking waste that are already located in the state of Ohio, and they are operating without a permit. They haven't been grandfathered into these new rules, but where we had unpermitted facilities, the Department of Natural Resources would go in and do an inspection, and we'd be able to get these inspection reports. We'd be able to see these horrible pictures of water running through these facilities next to a pile of radioactive filter socks, and watch that water roll out off of the site and watch the trucks drive through it and track that radioactivity out into the community. Well, now the new rules say that these companies, which we know are failing to protect communities from this radioactive exposure, are now allowed to do the inspections themselves. And they're the ones that are going to submit this information to the Department of Natural Resources. We will no longer have a Department of Natural Resources qualified personnel in these facilities doing these inspections themselves. So I will end with that. And I will just let you know that the state has given these radioactive waste processing facilities and these class 2 injection wells virtually carte blanche to locate these facilities anywhere in the state of Ohio and monitor them themselves and put in whatever information they would like into the Department of Natural Resources. They've given them a blank check. And as Ted has shown, even though our production has gone down, our waste is skyrocketing. So I just want to say thank you again. It's been a pleasure doing this presentation with Ted, and thank you again, Nancy, for this opportunity.
Well, thank you, Cheryl and Ted. We've learned a lot, however terrifying it may be. And now we have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. For those of you who want to ask questions, look for the Q&A icon on your screen. Click on it and type your questions for our speakers. You'll be recognized by first name if your question is chosen, unless you choose the anonymous option. We have 2 Q&A monitors today, Wayne Jennings from his home and Debbie Wright coming to us from Fellowship Hall at UUCC, both members of the Forum Committee. Debbie and Wayne, I'll turn it over to you now.
Well, I just want to start and say how depressing your presentation is. I just really can't believe how bad it is. But Chris does ask a question for those of us who don't understand radiation. Just how radioactive is this brine? And maybe compare it to something else we might have exposure to that we would understand, or even the radon in some of our homes, as an example.
Sure. So what I can tell you, we all know what uranium is, right? If I had a uranium mine in my backyard, I would be able to discharge 30 picocuries. Now, picocuries is that monitoring measurement definition, right? So if I had a radium mine in my backyard, I would be able to discharge 30 picocuries into the waterway. This legislation would allow 20,000 picocuries to be spread on our roadways. That's the level they're talking about. Background levels are usually in a, their picocuries are very small. They're in a decimal point, background levels, usually a decimal point of 3 numbers, okay? And unfortunately, brine it's like rolling your dice, right? It's like it's a crapshoot every single time. The only way that we would have a good data, right, for TED to have good data on what our brine levels of radioactivity were is if we tested every single batch that comes up. And then every single well, that radiation level, so we know we have like 3,500 or 2,500 wells for the big wells for hydraulic fracturing in the state. Every single well would have to be, every time they took a load out, they would have to continue to measure it every single time because that radioactivity changes over the production of that well, right? So it's a crapshoot. Every single time they spread brine, it's a crapshoot. It can be a different number, a different combination of numbers. And that level.
How dangerous is this radiation? I mean,
No level is safe. That's what EPA and the Ohio Department of Health tells us. No level is safe.
Cheryl, could I add something to that? The radium-226, the main isotope with a half-life of 1,600 years, is an alpha emitter. And normally, if you're talking about radiation, you kind of say, well, alpha, a piece of paper will stop that. But the trouble with the radium is that it's biologically active. And it's absorbed in your body and taken in. And now that alpha emitter can do some damage. It's right there, right next to your chromosomes, and it's right there where it can cause bone cancer and those things. So I just want to make sure our listeners understand this. It's not just the amount of radiation, but the type and the biological activity that's important.
Yeah, it mimics calcium in your body. It's a bone-seeking, cancer-causing material. And ODH and US EPA tells us that no level is safe. No level of exposure.
So
if this brine doesn't go, where would the brine go if it's not buried somewhere or spread on our roads?
It shouldn't be made.
Yeah, I mean,
it shouldn't be produced.
Right.
I mean,
I agree with you, but how are we going to heat our houses?
Well,
that's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really gets to you're talking about an industry that talks all the time about market forces and price signals and all that stuff when it comes to what they produce, but they don't want to adhere to any of those things when it comes to the waste that they produce. So I would argue that we need to be having a more holistic conversation about how waste is priced in Ohio. And also to Cheryl's point about testing it, like all of these things would cost something. So they would actually eliminate a lot of the bottom feeders, the really inefficient actors. And a lot of this stuff is, some people have talked about this should be going to arid environments and being processed in places where it costs quite a bit. And I think that would collapse the whole business model of oil and gas, and you're right, you do need to heat your homes, but heating your homes doesn't need to come with these levels of inefficiencies that just are amok in this industry and growing, not getting better, getting worse. And I think too, one thing I wanted to add about that is you're hearing a lot with regard to the current geopolitical situation. A lot of politicians are talking about drilling here, drilling there, re-drilling, going back into Carroll County and infilling and yada, yada, yada. What we're doing is we're just giving a subsidy to an industry that hasn't proved that it deserves it. And I do think that, yes, you have to heat your homes, but we're not putting a real environmentally holistic price on any of this stuff that they need. And that's why they use it so much. And they're not, as I was saying at the outset, you're not, what we've seen in the data that we've collected is the gas production in Ohio is entirely accounted for by the increase in water and waste. So they're not actually generating more gas. If you look at them, in terms of just overall production, you're having wells that are coming online that are stripper wells. They're not producing anything within 5 years. And they're using way more water and producing more waste to get that thing. So there's just all the onus and all the externalities are being foisted on Ohio, and none of them are being incorporated by the business models of this industry.
And do you pay for your water? Do you pay for clean water?
Right.
So these industries, right? Water, the mother and the Lord and put this water on this earth for all of us, right? It's out there, it's free. Why are we paying for it? Why are we paying for it? It's clean in its natural state. We are paying to have our water cleaned by a municipal plant because corporations are allowed to pollute it free of charge.
Yeah.
And we as individuals are responsible for paying to clean that up as a service before we can consume it. Okay, and that's what we're talking about. And Ted will tell you that when these folks started, they were using little more maybe than 1 million gallons per well to frack it the first time. Now we're at 20 million gallons the first time. And this water is gone. It can never be used again. It's never going to go back into the water cycle. At least you better hope not. Because if it gets back into the water cycle, we're in big trouble, right? So we got to heat our homes. We need clean water. What's the point at which our healthcare costs for cancer, our need for clean water, our need to clean our homes, where does that balance out, right? So we're giving subsidies to these companies to make this mess, but it turns up in our life, in our budget in one way or another. Either you're going to have to pay for it through your water bill, you're going to have to pay through your cancer bill, or you're going to have to pay through it, in climate change in this future. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about. And this, like everybody I talk to is like, why isn't this considered a hazardous waste? It's not even considered a hazardous waste. So like there are loopholes in just about every single major environmental law that gives this industry another subsidy. So by not having them have to dispose of it as a hazardous waste, like any other company would have to do, they get to just dump it on our roads and in these wells in the ground. right? If you own a gas station, your gas station on your corner is like 10 times higher regulated than the company that's out there punching a hole through aquifers and, you know, and groundwater system. So like, there is no level playing field in this. We gotta start over, and we gotta rethink. Well, like, even if you're not paying it for it in your heating bill, you're still paying for it. And are we going to continue to bear that burden, or is that burden going to go back to the company where it should have been in the first place?
Right, and I think too, just one more point on that is Ohio is bearing the burden of 2 other states to a large degree. I did want to point out quickly that I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago, you know, Penn State has their little thing that they do with the oil and gas industry at State College, where they have this conference, this confab of academics and industry folks. And I think it was 4 or 5 years ago where they started to talk a lot about it, permitting more Class 2 injection wells in Pennsylvania. They stopped having that conversation because it seemed like Ohio was serious about not permitting more Class 2 wells back then. Well, that's come and gone. As Cheryl pointed out, I mean, the underground injection control program in Ohio is way overmatched. They're way out of their league. And I think, you know, to the point of like, the other thing that needs to be talked about is, does this program that oversees our injection wells and does nothing, by the way, about the solid waste? Like, I didn't present to you any data on landfills and what's coming in because there is none. So we don't have, like, if we think that the Class 2 injection well thing is bad, the solid waste is even worse. And we know that stuff is even more super hot. So I think too, you know, what are some of the solutions as far as like this being a depressing talk? One of the solutions is to actually talk about whether this program in the DNR should have primacy over injection wells, and whether they have demonstrated since 1980 that they know what they're doing. I would argue they don't. I would argue that in 1980, they could have never foreseen this thing coming along. As I showed you, the data for what they thought about brine was like paled in comparison to what they're dealing with now. So I think the state has not demonstrated that they're not keeping up. I like to put it this way, you have state agencies that are living in an analog age, and you have the industry in a digital age moving hyper fast. So those 2 things have decoupled from each other, whereby now you have an industry that's just playing with the state, literally playing with us. And that's not a good thing. So I would say one of the positives, one of the things we can do is, like to Cheryl's point, develop this legislation and also have a really open, frank conversation, call our elected officials and ask them to ask and bring up in public settings, does this program deserve to have primacy over injection wells? The data demonstrates they don't and haven't for 10, 15 years. So.
Wayne, do you have a question?
Yeah, let's go on to a question just to clarify the presentations. Our anonymous attendee asked, could you explain the difference between legacy wells and conventional wells?
Yeah, so the legacy wells are the ones that, you know, those are the mom and pop wells that have been existing in existence in Ohio since the Rockefeller days. You know, millions and well, not millions, thousands and thousands of holes were poked into the ground in Ohio back in the day and to this day. Those are the wells that go down. I mean, like you would think, with the pump jacks all over the place. Those are the traditional oil and gas wells. What we're talking about now are these unconventional wells, and I didn't present this data, but these are unconventional wells. The fracked wells go down 6,000 or 7,000 feet, and then they go out 7,000 or 8,000 feet, and they go laterally. And what they do is they go down. I mean, if this is something that you all know, I excuse me, but they go down and they fracture, they puncture the shale, they open it up, they push water and sand into it so they can pull the gas out of it. That's markedly different than just trying to tap into a pool vertically and sucking the oil and gas out, primarily oil out. So that's the primary difference. And one thing I did want to say about legacy wells is, and Class 2 wells specifically, as far as looking around the corner, what's next? There's something disturbing that's happening in the United States with regard to the Biden administration's pushing of this this carbon capture and storage program and the 45Q program through the IRS, which would allow for oil and gas industry to pump CO2 into the ground in the name of what they call enhanced oil recovery, or EOR, where you shove CO2 into the ground to pull oil out of the ground in the name of ameliorating climate change. And we do have quite a few of these enhanced oil recovery wells in the state of Ohio. So that's another thing that people should pay attention to, is the industry, again, not being able to get their heads around the brine spreading issue, the brine production issue, the declines in production over time that are so steep. They're trying to just kind of swim faster and faster just to stand still. So there's a lot of issues to pay attention to over the next couple of years too, regardless of who's running DC.
This is a kind of long question. Please comment on how we can change standards for determining thresholds of magnitude of earthquakes due to injection wells. Currently, the ODNR helps to determine these thresholds, and the ODNR has no responsibility for protection of our groundwater. Why can't we reconfigure how we redo government oversight of the oil and gas industry in Ohio?
So that's a great question, and it really, it gets to a request that was just made in the Youngstown Meander Reservoir area. So folks I know up there are paying attention. There have been several earthquakes right off the shoreline of Lake Erie this spring. I think we're up to 10 now between the beginning of the year. And we do know that there are, injection wells in Lake County. There are injection wells in Aspenfield County. Well, this one in the Youngstown Meander area is really concerning. The Department of Natural Resources, I was there in 2020. I was working on this, and so was Ted in 2012 when the large earthquakes hit Youngstown and the problems that it caused. And the department did do their job. They went in, they shut down this well, they had them do seismicity tests. They did have a good protocol. They waited until, there were 3 or 4 of them. They identified that this was a problem and they took immediate action. They shut down this well and they had a seismicity standard that was an executive order that went into place and said, hey, we're going to have this seismicity threshold here. Any that hits above this, I believe it's 3, just 3, magnitude of 3, they're going to be shut down immediately. We're going to do an evaluation. Well, recently, somebody in the Meander Reservoir area petitioned the Oil and Gas Commission to ask them to allow stronger magnitudes of earthquakes before they would shut his well down. So DNR came and told him no, right? They did their job. They said no more than 3. He petitioned the Oil and Gas Commission, which was set up under threat by the Kasich administration, to allow for higher magnitude. So we have a situation here where the Meander Reservoir Dam is in rough shape, really rough shape. It's over 100 years old, and this one, injection well owner was going to petition to have it raised, which is just insanity. So I do want to say that the reaction to those earthquakes was timely, and they did set up an effective program, right, in order to, I believe that facility was closed down for close to 2 years. That's just off the top of my head. So they did have a good response. What they haven't addressed is the earthquakes and all the faults in the state of Ohio, right? They haven't addressed the pressurization. They haven't addressed the volume. And I'll let Ted speak more about those details, because those all come into factor when you're talking about earthquakes.
Yeah, I can't add much more to that. That was a great answer. I would just say that, one thing that's starting to, I probably shouldn't use this word, but percolate up is the issues that Cheryl mentioned about communication between different strata, geologic strata, and different wells. Like, you're putting so many holes in the ground and you're putting so much more stuff in the ground. Like putting a hole in the ground used to be pulling out. Now you're pushing stuff in. And what you're seeing is communication between wells, between strata, and all of a sudden you have these issues like we had with the Redbird wells in Washington County. You have, you know, these things are becoming more, it's now a plural. You have multiple events where you have communication between wells, and then you have these geysers that are basically developing in legacy wells, and you have legacy operators saying, you know, what the heck's going on here? You know, like, where did this come from? I didn't buy into this whole thing. So you're actually having oil operators in Washington County who are proving to be strange bedfellows with folks down there and saying, you know, we're with you, we're with you. Now, granted, that's just because they don't want to see their yield compromised. But the point is that you're now seeing whatever goes down must come up, and it's coming up in really unpredictable ways. You know, you have a state geologic survey at one point that said, you know, we have unlimited capacity to sop up all this stuff. We don't know that. I mean, I'm not saying that the answer is we don't know. You know, I always like to say Donald Rumsfeld has like the greatest quote of all time, which is, there are knowns, there are unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns, right? Well, we got all the above in Ohio. And especially when it comes to what Cheryl said, is the volumes and the pressures that we're putting our geology under right now, you cannot model that. The USGS knows they can't model that, and they have put a marker in the sand and said, yeah, indeed, there's a problem. Those quakes that Cheryl just talked about in Washington County, they are saying there's a causal link between that and injection wells. So even the most conservative of agencies is coming out, and has been for years, saying this whole thing. And also, you know, what they're seeing in Oklahoma is that the real problem with quakes, to the question that was originally asked, is the small quakes and the cumulative impact of the small quakes. Because the 5.6s, we know that's going to demolish a lot of stuff. But the small ones that go unmeasured is the real impact. And you actually are seeing real estate insurers pulling out of Oklahoma. And I would say that that's when the rubber meets the road as well. Is when they start to say we're out of here, that's going to be a real problem. Not to say that's happening in Ohio, but if you keep permitting and shoving stuff in the ground, who knows what's going to happen. So,
And the only reason these wells work is because they leak.
yeah, right.
The only reason. I wanted to mention that I did put in the chat, I don't know if y'all could see it, but I did put the Ohio Brine Task Force website in that. It's OH, the word brine, task force, one word, brine task force, ohbrinetaskforce.org. We have weekly calls. I see a number of your questions. These questions are great. You're talking about legal things. You're talking about, you know, radon and how we can help. These are all things that we're talking about on a weekly basis and strategizing about. And we have some pretty big moves that are coming up, and it's going to take a lot of support to get this stuff fixed. And so I'm so grateful for having us here. And if you're concerned, you have, I know Nancy has joined us on some of those calls that we have on certain weeks. You know, we can strategize, and the more people that we get involved in, that we get concerned, the more power we have to get this fixed.
Several of our questioners, as you just pointed out, are interested in trying to get a handle on how dangerous the radioactivity is. And we understand this is very difficult to do, but the comparison, Chris asks about the comparison of this radioactive risk to the radon in Boulder County, Colorado, where non-smokers are getting lung cancer because of the radon gas. And so how can we evaluate the risk? It's a tough one, I understand.
I mean, I'll yield to Cheryl. I would just say one quick thing, which is that the amount of data that we have on this topic, that is the quality and the quality of the radioactivity in the Marcellus Utica shale, the data sets are, the sample size is really small, but it's really not, it doesn't look very good. But I would also say that, you know, it just proves that we need more data, and the data just doesn't exist on a level that's in any way helpful. But I would also say too that, you know, there was someone mentioned, or I think Cheryl alluded to, the Austin Masters site down in Martins Ferry. And, you know, they're pretty proud of what they're doing down there with recycling radioactive waste. So I would say to, as far as heating our homes, kind of bringing it all back, is I think we all need to keep in mind that we could all stand to go visit some of these communities. Go visit Michelle Garman, who lives in Vienna Township, where there's a class 2 injection well next to her home. And yes, we need to heat our homes, but it's really important to understand that when we heat our homes, what's being put, what the kinds of people that are being put in the shadow of this kind of infrastructure. It's real people, it's real communities. And, it's really a shame that they don't receive the kind of attention they deserve. But I'll yield to Cheryl on some of the original question.
So, so we now have research in the state of Ohio that shows that radon levels in homes that are near hydraulic fracturing facilities, wells, waste disposal is much higher than in homes where they're not in an oil field. Colorado, right, has been in the process of using horizontal hydraulic fracturing for many more years than we have. They also have about, I would say 6 or 7 years on us of doing this process in urban areas. So it's not that far away from you. This process of extracting this, I mean, it's going on in Broadview Heights. I mean, it's not that the waste maybe not in your area, but the lion's share of that toxic process is going on right in Broadview Heights, okay? They put a test well on the east side of Cleveland so that the Case Western Reserve University could study it more, right? So the actual hydraulic fracturing process is going on right in your back door. What we know is that this Marcellus and Utica shale, which is where we are in Ohio and Western Pennsylvania, is probably the most radioactive shale play in the country, okay? So it's at higher levels than what they have in Colorado. What we don't have is as many holes. Now they got a hell of a lot more holes in Ohio and Pennsylvania because, that's where their sweet spot is, right? But all that waste is coming here. So it's getting to us one way or the other. The other thing we know is that this gas, this radiation it's not just limited to the waste or the air emission. It's still in the gas. And that's what we really need to start understanding, right? So whether it shows up through the pipe in your house, right? Or it shows up from you just living in this area of where the production actually happens. It's getting to us. And that's what we need to understand. And so there are studies that are actually going on right now, right? That are looking at whether this radiation can actually follow the low-lying levels in Appalachia and make their way, they dig these trenches when they put in the pipelines, right? They dig these trenches and then they co-locate pipelines in the same right-of-way. There's research going on right now to find out whether that gas and that radiation is following those paths of distribution into homes. So this stuff is, it's probably the hottest stuff in the country that's located here. The reason TED has such good data on the waste from Pennsylvania is because they track it. We don't even track it here. We don't know where the waste from Ohio wells go. They don't want us to know. And that's the problem. So so all these research, all these questions that you're asking, right? The state of Ohio does not want to know. They don't want us to know, right? We have research that says that babies are at risk when they're next to fracking or fracking waste. When their gestation period is located in a shale play or oil and gas development or waste area. We know that low birth weights, heart problems, spinal cord problems, right? There and I think I said low birth. We know that. We know it's in Pennsylvania. We already have the research on it. We know it's in Ohio. Since the University of Cincinnati has done this stuff. We know it travels through fault lines and comes up in other wells, right? But they don't even track where that waste goes for us to make those determinations. So how are we supposed to figure out exactly how radioactive this stuff is if we don't know, if they're not testing for the radioactivity level, if they're not telling us where it's actually going? And I recommend that you read this. There's a Ted, what's the name of Justin Noble's Rolling Stone piece?
Oh, geez, I don't know the name, but I'll put in a link.
Justin Noble wrote an excellent article, and we've been working closely with this reporter. America's Radioactive Secret, I believe that's the name of it. Where he talked to professionals that work on, work on drilling rigs all across the country. Their exposure is horrifying. And then we have a state that is denying us access to, and they're not even collecting the data so that we can figure this stuff out. There's also there's a compendium if you're really worried about the health risk of this. The Pittsburgh League of Women Voters produces a health, shale gas, and public health compendium every year with the latest research on there. I would suggest that, if y'all are interested from hearing, if you want to do a follow-up on this stuff in health, I can put you in contact with Heather Haar, who pulls that together every year. She would be happy to come, especially virtually. It makes it so much easier now virtually to come and have a discussion about the health effects, because Pittsburgh has a lot more data than we do. Thanks.
This is sort of a related question about monitoring, but it's an anonymous attendee. This sounds really cynical, but our healthcare industry should really be an ally in promoting water safety, but from a financial standpoint, they benefit from cancer care. If this is so, how do we create incentives to care about reducing cancer and therefore reducing the need for cancer treatments? I would just add that if we had a good public health system, you could track where problems are, because you'd have public health data in a public database for all over the country if we had that type of system, which we don't. But if we did, you could find these hotspots of where waste is being put. Don't you think?
So we have a gag order in the state of Ohio that physicians aren't even allowed to talk to a patient that comes in and has been exposed on the either in a traffic accident or on a drilling site. So they're not even allowed to talk to their patients about what they've been exposed to. And whoever this question came from hit the nail right on the head. There's no money to be made in cancer prevention. When is the last time you heard somebody talking about cancer prevention? It's always about a race for the cure, right? It's always about curing cancer. It's not about prevention. We had a petrochemical facility go up in Pennsylvania, and right across the street from it when it was a new oncologist office building. I do know that one of the other ways we can monitor this industry is by air pollution. And 12 years ago, when I was working with Buckeye Forest Network, by Forest Council, the state moved our air monitors out of Southeast Ohio so they could delist the whole region for ozone. So we don't even have monitors in the places where we need monitors anymore.
I was wondering, because veterinary medicine be a source of data for animals?
I was just going to say that I remember distinctly, as far as veterinarians are concerned, hearing stories in Noble and Guernsey County, anecdotally, but from multiple people, about increases in mortality of their beef herd and their dairy herd. I don't know if that data has manifest or if it's even available. Maybe Cheryl does, but I also know that in Western Wisconsin, where the sand mining is feeding the fracking industry, they have, we know of several people that live next to new sand mines, and they had like 2% mortality in their herds before the sand mines, and now they're up to 15%. And that, I know that from 3 or 4 beef and dairy farmers up in Wisconsin, but Wisconsin's not collecting that kind of data either. So a lot of it's like kind of the plural of anecdote is data at this point, but I don't know, maybe Cheryl's more information on that.
And that's a big thing. It's like data justice, right? I mean, what
Yeah.
has been collected? What has been collected? I actually have been doing a search for 2 weeks for animal death, been trying to grab that data, because if you look at that map where that brine's been spread, that's, you know, that's a breadbasket of Ohio, right? I mean, that's where they're raising not only animals, but crops. And so I've been trying to find that, you know, data and information. And I know when the industry first started, that data was available. Okay, we could see when fracking first started, we did have stories from communities where that data was being collected and they were doing research on it. And I do know that it's very risky, since a lot of our institutions that do that kind of data are public institutions and are usually supported by public dollars. And I will tell you that I've been involved in several issues in the state of Ohio where pollution and health disparity were being identified by research from environmental pollution. And, you know, one of our state's leading water laboratories lost $750,000 a year for their water research lab because of the research that they were doing connecting that pollution to human health. So it's a very difficult. I mean, we can't really even get our public health offices to engage on this issue because they are supported by state tax dollars. So it's a much bigger problem, and it's like a spider web. It's everywhere. It's local electeds. It's you know, it's our institutions and our agencies being hand-tied from providing us with this information. And they're, you know, I work with like folks that are busy around the state restoring streams and wetlands, and they, you know, they could lose their jobs for talking to us about this type of information. So it's really hard, but we are working on some, we have some very critical and very pointed actions. I can't say a lot more in a public forum, but very pointed actions that are coming up this late spring and summer. We will be working to hold Department of Natural Resources and our legislature accountable for state sanctioned poisoning is what we have going on here, folks. I'm just going to be real. It's state sanctioned poisoning. So we have some moves that we're working on this late spring and summer that I think will go a long way to hold this industry accountable.
Yeah, just one more thing about that is about the data thing I was working on 2 projects in the last couple of weeks, a couple of grants were applying to the US EPA, and the US EPA wants us to use something called EJ Screen, which is their mapping tool. And it's funny because if you look at the counties that were on our grants, I mean, I've been to all these counties. There's no way they shouldn't be like number 10 out of 10 for an EJ screen. And they don't even come up as like a 1 or a 2 if you want to use the traditional definition, terminology, mapping, whatever for EJ screening. That's not to say that I kind of look at it this way. EJ screening is really good at high population centers and point source pollution events or people like industrial corridors like Southwest Detroit or Pittsburgh, you name it. But when it comes to rural Ohio, where this infrastructure is so diffuse across the landscape and so hidden, frankly, the traditional ways in which data is generated or what we even call data to define EJ does not do well. So it really does require that there's a revisiting, whether it's DNR or the US EPA, of what we call EJ, because, for example, Washington County was on one grant, that's in Southwest Pennsylvania. I mean, if you go to Washington County, it's insane. Belmont and Monroe County and Jefferson County, Ohio, equally insane. And yet they didn't even have a blip. So to Cheryl's point, it's like, you know, the way that we define this stuff really does need, it's not keeping up with what's going on, and it in no way reflects what's going on with the oil and gas sector.
I had the exact same, I was on that training, Ted, and I just had the exact same impression that this
Yeah.
is so outdated in
Yeah.
capturing just the spider web of effects of this entire industry. They're not tracking it because they don't have to permit it. That's the other thing. You know, our compressor stations, those big compressor stations, like the one in Medina County that's just below you, like
Yeah.
it's not on their map. You know, these processes, cryogenic plants, you know, because they're able to get in these, you know, these loopholes, they don't even show up on US EPA map data.
Right.
It's really frustrating. And, you know, I mean, it's life-threatening for, you know, Ohio has the highest concentration, the highest number of people in the entire country that are exposed to oil and gas pollution. It's called this threat zone, right? They live within 1.5 miles of hydraulic fracturing infrastructure. We have more people than anyone in the entire country. 3.1 million, it's almost a full third of Ohioans are threatened by this industry. It's because we're a small area and we have a high concentration of people here. So when you look at Texas, they may have more wells than we do, but their concentration of people are limited to a very few places. So we have 3.1 million people that are exposed to hazardous levels of oil and gas pollution in the state. And that's by the work of Ted at FracTracker, working with Earthworks, came up with the oil and gas threat map.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, it's ridiculous. They can put it together, but our state agencies don't seem to be able to put it together.
Cheryl and Ted, we need to go to completing the forum and a couple of announcements. I want to say how much we appreciate your speaking with us today, and also your advocacy for us here in Ohio, advocating for the safety of our water sources and our communities. A big thank you to Nancy, our coordinator, for bringing us such well-informed speakers today. Thank you to our question moderators, and especially to you, our valued attendees. We especially appreciate your very wise and intelligent questions. Now, we invite all of you to join our service at 11 this morning. The topic is Allowable Answers, recognizing Transgender Day of Visibility, coming up March 31, and how UU principles guide us toward a fuller celebration of human identity. The speaker is our minister, Dr. Randy Partain. We meet in person inside the congregation sanctuary at 21600 Shaker Boulevard, Belvoir Oval in Shaker Heights. Please wear a mask to come in person. If you can't join us in person, you can join the live stream by going to uucleveland.org. That's uucleveland.org, and clicking on the YouTube icon. Or you can see it on our Facebook page, Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. So this is the last forum of the 2022 Winter Spring Series. If you want to see recordings of some of the 8 forums that we've done, including this one, you can view them by going to recordings on YouTube. Look for us again for our autumn series with more important topics and really good speakers.